Welcome, welcome. Lovely to see you all. Thanks for joining us today. Here we are, the final in our webinars for Earth Month. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jody Evans. I'm one of the co-founders of Code Pink and part of the War is Not Green campaign. And tomorrow, Earth Day, here we are. This month has been a great opportunity to help people understand that war is not green, war does not serve the planet. And there are so many ways to learn about that and teach it. And when we learn, we can share it. So that's, part of what we try to do at Code Pink, to educate, inspire, and activate. And what was super, shocking when we first started creating this campaign is how few people really understand the cost of war to the planet. And that's why the focus of this campaign is to get the environmental movement, who's tasked with climate, stopping climate change and caring for the planet, to embrace that this is really a destructive piece. We call it the elephant in the room, and that we need to be pointing to the elephant in the room also while we're doing all the other work that people are engaged with. So thank you. I see folks are putting in their names and where they are. Thank you so much for speaking to each other in the chat. And Grace will be in the chat. Grace, thanks for taking care of us today, helping us and supporting us. She'll be putting in the chat things that you can link to as we're talking about them, but we have an incredible lineup today. Super excited. Aaron's been leading us through this whole month, so he'll put in the context. And then we have our guests that will kind of take us through the overview as we end the month, and we'll end with some things you can do moving forward. So I want to thank you for joining us and move you to the hands of Aaron, who is our War is Not Green campaign coordinator. And he also is our East Coast regional organizer. So if you're in the East Coast, he's also there to help you engage locally. So Aaron, thank you. Take it away.
Thanks, Jody. And yeah, hi everyone. I'm so glad to be here as we wrap up this series and, the day before Earth Day, but we've been engaged in this all month long. And so for anyone who hasn't been with us in these past few teach-ins, I highly recommend you go watch the previous ones, not for my sake, but really for our collective sake and because of the absolutely incredible speakers and organizations that we have, the campaigns that they're engaged in that you can tap in on. And I think what's really been so meaningful for me in a lot of these is how grounding each of them has been. In each of one of them, we've gotten really a sense of interconnected struggles. And the thesis of all of these, I think, is that across movements, across experiences and disciplines, is that the movement against war and imperialism and for national liberation and internationalism is the movement for the planet. I've been continuously reiterating, and we will continue to reiterate it, no matter how sick of you are of hearing it, that the US military is the #1 institutional polluter in the world, with over 800 military bases that leak toxic chemicals like PFAS, which is, of course, a toxic cancer-causing chemical. And any movement that really wants to fight for planetary life must also be against the killing machine of the war economy. We know, of course, that US wars are fueled by resource extraction and exploitation of labor that continues to no end. And last week, we really talked about the sheer insanity and stupidity of it, and of new Cold War dynamics again in escalation against China and escalation against Iran. These were never good ideas. And ultimately, of course, when the US tries to stamp out life-giving projects and possibilities for cooperation on green energy or escalation, it only backfires on us, on the world, and on any possibility for life on the planet. And so, of course, endless extraction and accumulation and exploitation, they're all detrimental to life everywhere, and that will only collapse in on itself the more it continues. And so in Palestine, and we talked about this a lot in the first webinar, and of course, it's been a constant thread through all of them, we've really seen ecocide the total destruction of the natural environment as a tactic of genocide over the last year and a half, where the poisoning of the water system, the genocide also emitted more than 20 countries in the first 2 months alone. And this has, of course, been paired with violent land grabs, replacement of the landscape with European pine trees instead of the indigenous landscape there that harms biodiversity. And that's all, of course, for the sake of having a proxy in the region, that being Israel, to extract more oil from the ground. During the first webinar, we also talked about the horrific destruction in the Congo, where millions have been killed and thousands of acres of forestry, which is critical to the survival of the planet, has been destroyed by a Western quest for minerals and resource extraction going back to the Cold War. I have said this each time, but I highly recommend you watch Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat for a little bit more of the history there. And it's an incredible piece. And so the extraction that we've had globally is also a project that the Filipino people have been resisting for decades, which we talked about in the first webinar. It's an immensely agricultural society. And the Philippines is currently being made into what some have described as a sort of quote unquote new Ukraine as a proxy in the war against China. And while the Ukraine war is possibly de-escalating, we'll see, it's leaving agricultural and ecological destruction that will take a long time to come back from. And so, sort of continuing on the thread of the Philippines, we also talked about bases and physical military presence around the world in our second webinar, with over 800 poisonous literal launching pads for war around the world that the US uses in sort of every category. And that accounts for almost 90, the US's military bases globally account for 90% worldwide. We really sort of went in on some specific examples there with comrades from the Diaspora Palante Collective in Puerto Rico, where the island has been used for Southern Command and stamping over Latin America and the Caribbean and in all of its projects. And we also learned about resistance to the naval base on Vieques, which is an island off the coast of mainland Puerto Rico. And that was across societal sectors and really showed how widespread the agricultural and impacts and societal impacts of US militarism are and how interrelated they are. The US presence in Puerto Rico is also parallel to in Hawaii, which we talked about, where indigenous resistance to oil spillages have been a huge part of what it means to defend the land. And we talked with the Oahu water protectors about that. And then with Noditol, we also learned about bases and military presence in Korea, and where, because bases are in essence a form of US territory, the oil spillages that need to be cleaned up by the US and can't by anyone else. They're mini colonies, essentially. And of course, we talked about that in the context of escalation about China, but also the agroecological resistance to US sanctions in North Korea as well. I think this all hits home to how, of course, the return of indigenous land and national liberation from Hawaii to Vieques to Korea to Palestine is ultimately a project for the planet and is directly that in all of these areas, and the responsibility that we have here to oppose US militarism from within. And so once again, the US military is the #1 institutional polluter in the world. It wreaks local environmental havoc everywhere with deadly and global consequences, but it's still, unfortunately, the elephant in the room in so many spaces, which we've been talking about and which we'll be addressing a lot tonight. And that's because we're trying to build a unified movement that recognizes all of what I just said. And we just released an open letter with over 70 different organizations as sort of a first step to just sort of recognize the impacts of US militarism on the planet. You can sign it and definitely send to other organizations where, trying to convene and get out of silos that where the US climate movement is in some ways separate from the anti-war movement, even though ultimately we have so many of the same targets and the same goals and need to recognize what's at the root of it all. And so definitely sign that. You can also join us at our next War is Not Green community call to sort of get into all of this a little bit more. But tonight we'll fill in some of these gaps for how to create a climate movement that addresses all of this in the anti-militarist, internationalist, anti-war climate movement, and what it means to disarm Earth Day. which has been the title of the series, by continuing to both disrupt traditional notions of what the environmental looks like, or the greenwashing of colonialism, or science conferences sponsored by weapons manufacturers. And we'll be talking about the necessity for the planet to cut the Pentagon, disarm the empire, and build the movement that we really need. And so I'll pass it back to Jody before we get into our incredible speakers for the night.
Thank you so much, Erin. Yeah, so there's a lot to learn here because we want you to learn it so you can also be engaged with us and help us teach others. Because this is the elephant in the room, and we need to build a big enough movement to affect it. And that's why it's so exciting to have Danica with us today. Danica is the amazing co-director of Code Pink. She oversees our campaigns and local organizing. She's a brilliant writer, leader, and she's a bridge to all things. For me, baseball, hot dogs, and Chicago. She writes our campaigns weekly and explains the madness of war on her TikTok. Don't miss them because they're really grounding. And in that way that she has also a space where you can read her heart and wisdom when she shares it on what do you call it?
I have a Substack. It's just my first name. Yeah, Substack.org. Yeah.
Cool. So she's going to talk about the relationship of our campaign, Cut the Pentagon, and War is Not Green. Thanks for being with us, Danica.
Thanks, Jody. Thanks, Erin. I am so happy to be on tonight because we got to talk about movement building, which I think is what you were both referring to. And I know you both probably have said it a trillion times, once for every dollar towards the Pentagon budget, during these webinars, that the Pentagon's the largest institutional polluter. But I also think it's the largest example to use for backwards priorities when we're talking about movement building. It's a perfect demonstration to people for what is wrong with this country and what's wrong with the economic system that this world operates on. Because there's tangible things that we could point to. So like, for example, we feel climate change here, right? The hurricanes, the fires, we do feel it here. But we're also safeguarded from some of it in ways that the global south is not, right? The global south bears a huge brunt of the effects of climate change because they have less resources than the United States of America does. The Pentagon budget is the largest thing that you could point to for something that like feels real, something feels close to home. That you could say like this is a detriment to your life. If you see the ways the government is screwing you over, like this is a just one example of a giant backwards priority that we have, and you could bring people deeper that way. And I think the reason the Pentagon budget is so important in these conversations that we have, whether it be about democracy or climate change, is it has pretty much everything to do with the trajectory of the Pentagon budget. And the trajectory has been one of endless spending, increased privatization, and less democracy. And I'll explain all three of those, but it hasn't always been that way, I guess. I think you can mark a moment when the US Pentagon spending really took off, and that was after World War II. When war spending started spiking, the story goes that people's material outcomes in the United States got a lot better. And obviously, that was not the case for everyone. But that is the popular narrative that was built. That's what was like literally taught to me in my history classes in public high school. So, um, like I said, the trajectory is one of endless spending, increased privatization, and less democracy. So privatization pushes towards endless growth because the private companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon are making 50% of that $1 trillion, which is it's over $1 trillion. But the top line official budget is $1 trillion for the Pentagon about. And they will always want that top line to be higher. And these private companies are the ones with access to our politicians, not us, right? So they will always push for a higher top line because then they make more profits. Which leads us to the less democracy portion is I think it's clear as day that people understand that like regular Americans, like people talk to their families and neighbors, we don't want more war, yet we get more war, yet we get more war spending. We don't want cuts to Medicaid, yet that's something being realistically floated in Washington, D.C. The people in D.C. are very out of touch with the people. People feel like they have no actual hands on the levers of power because they don't. Because the people who make our policy do not have our best interests at heart. They have the best interests of the people, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, etc. Um, and when it comes to the climate and these companies, the increased privatization of the Pentagon budget, which is like there's no accountability. These companies buy off like or like they've essentially bribed members of Congress to give them bigger Pentagon contracts. So the privatization leads to less accountability when it's not like a an arm of the US government or US military. So you have these companies doing whatever the hell they want with no regulation. So it's worse for human rights. The privatization is worse for human rights and worse for climate. I see like Lockheed Martin votes on shareholder resolutions every single year. And for the last few years, every other year or so, they've had uh two resolutions. One that's let's protect let's have a human rights report and let's have a report on how Lockheed Martin is working to reduce our pollution. And they routinely, and every single time, ask their shareholders to vote no on both of those things. They don't want accountability because the record would be quite bad. Um, so people have a government who doesn't do it, like they don't do anything for them, the rest of the and bombs the rest of the world without anyone's consent. There's privatization with no accountability for war crimes or ecocide. And on top of that, they're destroying the planet because they have no interest not to. Like these are rich people. These are billionaires with access to lots of resources to protect themselves. You're talking about Elon, like Elon's talking about going to Mars, for example. Like they are thinking like they, people who were dealing with the fires, who had less money than people who in like people have less money to deal with the effects of climate change than these billionaires do. They're not thinking about us because they don't have to have our best interests at heart. Um, and the masses will always get left behind, which I think leaves room for us in the anti-war movement and people in the climate movement to build together because we have ultimately in this trajectory, we'll have a lot more in common and a lot more reason to be in solidarity with people in the global south than we do with these ruling class elites running our country. Um, so the movement for both the anti-war movement and the climate movement can use this trajectory because it's only getting worse and more obvious to people. As their material realities get worse, whether it is directly linked to the climate or directly linked to their economic status, you can use this trajectory to build the movement. People can feel the tension of not being represented and constantly and consistently getting the short end of the stick and more often getting the short end of the stick than ever before. Cut the Pentagon is what you can tug on people to like bring them into the movement. And just a couple of quick facts that I think work for when you're talking to people and when you're building this movement. 50% of the Pentagon budget goes to private companies. The top line is $1 trillion. That's effing crazy. That's crazy. Um, the corruption, lack of accountability, lack of democracy I talked about, the austerity for everything but the people's needs. They will give Lockheed Martin $2 trillion to build a bad fighter jet, but they will not give you health care. Uh, Bought off politicians, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, they all donate to these politicians' campaigns. And these companies are back to the wing talking point. These companies are siphoning. There's a brain drain from STEM to directly to the weapons industry. They are siphoning our brightest minds in STEM to make bombs instead of things that can help save the planet. Um, and like Elon's not doing much, sorry, but like everyone driving an individual Tesla while African countries are gutted for their resources won't save the planet and it will not save us. Um, so there's a story to tell with Cut the Pentagon. I think it's really useful. It touches people's hearts. Um, and it's necessary for bringing in the climate movement people. Um, it is the elephant in the room. And there's no world that's safe from the acceleration of climate change if the United States keeps spending this much on war. There is no future if we do not cut the Pentagon, if we do not build the movement around cut the Pentagon, and war is not green. Um, so yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you for having me. I'll pass it back to Aaron or Jody. Not sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for boiling it down so clearly. And really, I think giving sort of some of the points and headliners of the conversations that we need to have and ways and mechanisms of building. And so next we have the incredible Anthony Rogers-Wright, who is a fellow Clark alum, I just learned, but in Worcester, Massachusetts. But Anthony is an international climate and environmental liberation and racial justice advocate and practitioner, a writer and policy expert who resides in Omaha with his family and mischievous cats, Evil Ernie and Malachai, the mayhem maker. He is a proud and active member of the Black Alliance for Peace and Movement for Black Lives. Anthony was selected as one of the grist.org 50 environmentalists he'll be talking about in 2016 and recognized as one of New York City's 100 most influential environmental leaders in 2022 by City and State magazine. He's written numerous articles discussing the axiomatic nexus of the climate crisis, militarism, and racial injustice, and has spoken on the subject at universities throughout the US and Europe. His first book, Good Friday, The Necessary Death of the US Climate Movement and Pathways for Its Resurrection, is scheduled for release this fall. And Anthony's radio program, Full Spectrum with Anthony Rogers-Wright, airs on the WPFW network on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. I'll give it to you to take it away.
Thank you so much, Aaron. And thank you, Danica. So good to be on this panel with you. Big virtual fan. Hope we get to meet in person someday since we're both in the Midwest. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining this evening. A lot going on, and the eve of Earth Day. You know, I'll be straight up. We had a brief conversation before starting this all off. We know that right now, many climate groups, if not all of them, are hanging in the balance, awaiting to see what the hater in chief will be doing tomorrow with some potential. He's just such a troll with some executive orders targeting climate groups and attacking potentially their tax exempt status. We're concerned. However, we still think that to Danica's points about, the need for larger unified movements, that our critiques of the climate community are certainly not coming from a place of acrimony and certainly not coming from a place of not holding them and holding all groups that are under attack right now by this administration. So I just wanted to name that. Rather than look at me for the next 10 or 15 minutes, I did prepare a PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my screen and start that. Aaron, can we all see that? Are we all seeing this screen?
Yeah.
Yay, awesome. Great. So, as Danica started us off with, I mean, there's obviously a nefarious and axiomatic nexus between the climate crisis increasing militarism. And I want to talk to you about that today with a few case studies, and then talk about, the Black Alliance for Peace's approach and stances on militarized institutions, including NATO, AFRICOM, all the comms, really, all the comms having to do with the U.S. military. I think Aaron offered a very, very good setting for what we're dealing with when we talk about the U.S. military, and we'll get into that a bit more as well. And then I will so look forward to your questions. Aaron, I will make this PowerPoint available to you so that you can send to everyone on this call, and even folk who didn't make it, because it's sort of like a fish concert. Like once the performance is over, it belongs to the audience, and it's yours. No proprietariness when it comes to liberation and revolution. So with that, we'll get started. First, we have to get grounded in what we're talking about when we talk about climate change, right? Climate change is the intersection of white supremacy ideology, colonization, and patriarchy. I think it goes back to what my dear brother Hopkins once said. You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism. And that establishes the nexus between climate change and racialized aspects of it, including its disproportionate impacts. Danica brought up many of the instances where we're seeing this already in the underdeveloped South, as I like to call it. And we also know that these three entities, white supremacy, colonization, and patriarchy, have to be upheld somehow. They're not just upheld by magic and magical spells and by sheer will of white supremacy. Militarism, of course, is necessary to uphold all of these entities that form the intersection of climate change and the interlinked crises of increased militarism and the increased climate impacts. And I think that I also just want to state that, of course, climate change is obviously a domestic issue, an international issue. Also, but we face those impacts on a localized level. So when we talk about militarism at the Black Alliance for Peace, we're certainly not just talking about the U.S. military. We're talking about all forms of militarism, including domestic forms of militarism vis-a-vis law enforcement agencies in the United States, including but not limited to your local police department, your county sheriff department, of course, agents of ICE, the FBI, et cetera, and all kinds of other entities whose acronyms and abbreviations I don't know, but they're equally nefarious, and they are all meant to uphold empire and oppress and suppress marginalized and racialized people. Cop City, right? We also talk about this idea of imperialism. We also have to talk about boomerang imperialism, this idea of some of the military apparatuses that the United States has funded and instituted, and certainly in the case of the state of Israel, is coming back to us now through increased surveillance, cop cities all across the country, and now with this advent of so-called artificial intelligence. And I think the only thing artificial about the intelligence of AI is this idea that it's a good thing for us, in addition to the amount of emissions and its energy appetite, which can only be described as obese. We also know that AI is being used and will increasingly be used to uphold militarism and a state of surveillance, et cetera. So just wanted to frame it with that. Here's just, a simple graph. I mean, there is a one-to-one, but it's probably not even this tidy, the correlation between militarism and climate change. And the reason why it's probably not one-to-one, because we can't just think about it as emissions. We know, and this year we will be commemorating the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, of course, down in New Orleans. And we saw what happened after that climate disaster. That human-fueled climate disaster, massive militarism, right? Cops literally on top of precincts shooting at people who were trying to get food and shelter and sustenance after being so uprooted from a storm that they had little hand in creating. And then also the aftermath of that storm, of course, as well, which led to massive displacement. We saw the worst aspects of the prison industrial complex. These are all forms of militarism. And we have to think about it in terms of emissions, the carceral state, and how the carceral state and the police state increases after so-called natural disasters. So this correlation at this point is totally irrefutable. But as we move on to some of the more specific studies, we know we are still, as Danica brought up, I mean, we are still in the midst of a genocide right now against the Palestinian people, which is worsening by the day. And we have to keep talking about it. And we definitely have to keep talking about it from a lens of militarism, genocide, human rights, or the lack thereof, and then, of course, the climate crisis. So when we think about the Nakba, I'm hoping everyone knows what the Nakba is. It's still happening, but the the acute aspect of the Nakba, of course, was the forced displacement of Palestinian people by European Zionists in the late 1940s. It's made up of a sequence of acts: massacres, enforced displacements, land dispossession, settlements, ongoing daily violence. And it's far from an understanding of the environment or how it's damaged due to the Israeli settler state as a passive landscape. Israeli settler colonialism is an active tool of military warfare in and around the occupied Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank. We see this with the destruction of farmland, with the destruction of trees, with the prohibition of even planting and harvesting olives, and then of course with the strategic and intentional poisoning of water sources or taking them over altogether. Settler colonialism is a form of domination, and it violently disrupts human relationships with their environments. This is not just limited, of course, to what's happening in Palestine. This is global. This is a global consequence of militarism and colonization. And then finally, this all leads up to the sum of this equation, which is the ongoing Nakba. It's not over. It's a quotidian way of life, and an element of life, I should say, for Palestinian people, is a process of colonially imposed climate change. So that's case study number one: eco-warfare as a tool of genocide and war crimes in the case of the Israeli settler state and the people of Palestine. We're complicit, and so are many other countries. Here's just a quick graph of you can't have a genocidal war machine without fossil fuels. And the biggest funders of Israel's fossil fuel war machine, surprise, surprise, United States of America, the Russian Federation, mainly in the form of frat gas. I don't know if that is still the case with, of course, this fictitious war between Ukraine and Russia, which we'll get to in a moment. Brazil, very, very unfortunate to see them on this list, but a lot of Lula's let's just call them contradictions, to be diplomatic, are being elucidated by the day. Albania, Greece, and our little fascist state of Italy, making sure that they are also contributing to the genocidal war machine, which is a strange contradiction because PM Merloni has kind of spoken out against genocide, but genocide also makes some people money, as war does, as Danica and Aaron brought up earlier. And this is a graphic representation of that. Case study number two: Ukraine and NATO. This is where it starts to get like really, really lucid about the nexus of war, militarism, and the climate crisis. Emissions top 230 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's coal, frat gas, all the crap that we're emitting into the atmosphere that we need to stop doing yesterday, and still we will probably exceed the 1.5 degree threshold that was set at the Paris COP, or as I like to call it, COP Out conference of 2015, put on by the United Nations. By the end of the third year of this conflict, this manufactured conflict, assessment by nonprofit initiatives on greenhouse gas accounting board revealed the following. This is the equivalent, these 230 metric tons, of the annual emissions of Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia combined, or emissions of 120 million fossil fuel powered automobiles. A team of researchers also attributed the sharp rise primarily to warfare, including fuel-powered tanks, fortification construction, trenches, and all of that horrible stuff that comes with war. And we're also talking about the manufacturing, right? Manufacturing weapons produces emissions, explosives, and military equipment. And then there's also the impact on climate through emissions from artillery shells just being shot, which were in significant numbers throughout 2024. And this is even with drones becoming a prominent feature of the conflict. We still have these artillery shells that are accounting for a lot of these emissions. So moving this all to a big culprit of this fictitious fossil-fueled war, we move to speak about NATO. And this is just a snapshot, really. NATO's overall military spending in 2023, $1.34 trillion. And that produced 233 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's more than Colombia, where I just got back from yesterday, as a matter of fact, and Qatar's annual greenhouse gas emissions. NATO's military spending increase of 126 billion in 2023. Just that 126 billion increase will produce 31 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, and that's the equivalent of 6.7 million average US cars on the road. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, states that a 43% reduction in emissions by 2030, this is globally, is necessary to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. I'm sorry to say that we're going to blow through that threshold. We're like well on our way. And that would require in itself annual reductions of military emissions by 5%. And given that NATO wants to increase their spending, and did increase its spending by 15% in 2023. We're nowhere near that number of 43%, and militarism is a big part of that. And then finally, NATO claims a record 2/3 of its members will meet 2% of its GDP target by 2028. And when that happens, it's kind of like, or no, if that happens, we're not going to let that happen. Sorry, Aaron and Danica, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to do what we have to do to prevent that from happening. But if that does happen, if that were to happen, I should say, the military carbon footprint of 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's more than the annual greenhouse gas emissions of Russia. So our takeaways from the Black Alliance for Peace are pretty comprehensive. We do see NATO as a criminal military structure whose only purpose is providing the military material basis for maintenance of Western colonial empire, namely US, EU, and NATO, or white supremacy power, and it's a structure of a white colonial power construct. The Obama-Biden administration are culprits. They used NATO for their attack on Libya in 2011. So here we're seeing NATO also in the nexus with AFRICOM and AFRICOM's operations on the continent, in South America with SOUTHCOM, CARIBRICOM as with their operations with the Revolutionary Republic of Haiti. NATO is being used for all of that to basically spread global military empire and global military emissions. The focus on Ukraine is very, very important, but at BAP, we also recognize the bipartisan commitment, the duopoly, Democrats, Republicans alike, to this idea of U.S. security through what is sometimes referred to as a full spectrum of dominance. And it's a utilization of military first to uphold empire that is included in that full spectrum dominance. And it's necessary to achieve continued U.S. global dominance, at least militarily. Well, we'll see how long that global dominance lasts. Empires fall. We are seeing the cracks in U.S. empire as we speak. And if they continue this trade war with China, those fissures will rupture even more. And then we finally conclude that as African people, but all people of conscience, just to be clear, this axis of domination represents the greatest threat to peace, human rights, and social justice on the planet today. Peace is good for the climate. War is bad for the climate. That's the big takeaway from that. A few more slides. I don't really need to go through this. Aaron nailed it already. The U.S. military is a global climate criminal. There's no other way to put it. Some other aspects that I'm not sure if Aaron named. The Department of Defense is the single largest consumer of energy in the United States of America. And we're not even counting AI yet because we don't have the full numbers. And we don't have the full numbers on U.S. military emissions because they don't release them readily. And we're going to have to figure out something with that. But also what we need a study of Aaron and Danica and everyone else on the call, and something we should think about getting funded soon. We don't have an account of the emissions of domestic militarized forces, right? If you go to Black and brown and overpoliced communities, by the way, as we're getting into the warmer months, they keep their cars running, right? When they're, even when they're just sitting there to keep themselves cool. And then, of course, we know that they're using warfare materials in our communities, MRAPs and other, toys that they like to play with. So we really need that assessment because we don't have a full account of aggregate emissions domestically from domestic militarized forces. And that's going to become increasingly necessary as a tool to stop them. But the last thing that I'll say is that since 2001, the Department of Defense has consistently consumed between 77 and 80% of total U.S. energy consumption. That's all federal agencies, USDA, EPA, Commerce, Treasury. That'll probably change with the advent of AI, but it's going to be even more, right? So these are all things that we have to consider. But the U.S. military is a global climate criminal, and it's possible that we should start thinking about calling the ICC on the U.S. military for myriad reasons, including what they're doing to the planet and people in the underdeveloped South as a result of maintaining this. And this is what it looks like. Aaron named this, right? Here are the U.S. bases around the world. I mean, maintaining empire is expensive and takes a lot of fossil fuels, and that leads to a lot of emissions. And this is like back from 2022, right? I mean, there are probably more bases than this now. I just got back from South America, Ecuador, and Colombia, where we know that the President Trump, in collusion with the Ecuadorian president Noboa, are talking about U.S. military bases there. There's a military base kind of under construction on an island off the coast of Colombia. So it's just getting worse. But this is what maintaining empire looks like. What we're not seeing here, of course, is how much each of these and the amount of emissions each of these entities are responsible for. Last thing I'll say on this is, and I hope this segues nicely into my dear brother Max, who is an incredible author and one of my favorite writers on the Green New Deal. We have to be careful of false solutions and cooperative initiatives. Like, for instance, the Democrat Party's version of the Green New Deal. Here are its limitations. You can read them, including this idea of net zero, which is fake, doesn't exist. It's impossible. We can get into that more in the Q&A. Nuclear power, also a form of militarism. When you talk about the extraction that is necessary and the resource control that you need to have, this in a domestic sense, this will be aimed at our indigenous siblings, where all these materials that they need, all these minerals that they need reside. That is a delicious irony that all this crap that the military needs is located under sovereign indigenous territory. So free, prior, and informed consent is also a peace initiative, as well as an initiative that recognizes indigenous sovereignty, as well as what recognizes indigenous self-determination, which is to say it recognizes indigenous humanity while also being a tool against war. But the last thing that we prosecute regarding the Democrat Party's Green New Deal limitations, no mention of the need for deep cuts in military spending and operations to help pay for a Green New Deal while slashing emissions in the process. And that this all comes from the Green Party and a need for an eco-socialist Green New Deal and an eco-socialist lens to also attacking and prosecuting and ending this scourge of militarism as part of our efforts for Earth Day. So we really have to turn up the heat. We've got to ask our climate community to talk about this more. It's simply not happening enough. And it's going to be up to us to really shift the narrative and make sure more people establish this nexus. I'm going to skip this until we get to the next part, because I think I'm probably at time, Aaron, yeah? Okay, so we'll come back to this, but thanks for coming to my Code Pink talk.
Bravo! That was fantastic.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, that was absolutely fantastic. And yeah, I think the zone of peace is absolutely something to uplift that we can get to after Max.
You made us all smarter. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and that does segue incredibly well into the next segment, where we'll be hearing from Max Isle, who unfortunately was not able to be here in person. He's based in Tunisia and is traveling. But I did a pre-recorded interview ahead of time with him. Max is a fellow at Meckham / the University of Tunis, a senior fellow at the Department of Conflict and Development Studies at Ghent University, and a researcher with the Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment. He's the author of a recently titled book, A People's Green New Deal, which the link will be in to get it, and I'm pretty sure it's also available for free from the publisher, as well as an editor at Agrarian South, Middle East Critique, and Journal of Labor and Society. Max's work has appeared in Agrarian South, the Journal of Peasant Studies, Globalization's Middle East Critique, Review of African Political Economy, Middle East Report, and many other scholarly and popular journals. He researches climate politics, Tunisian national liberation, agrarian politics in the Arab region, and ecological planning in Arab North, in African intellectual. And I will share my screen to play the video where you will see my bedhead. So thank you so much for being here and part of this webinar in a pre-recorded format. Really appreciate your work so much and your interventions. And so I'm really excited for the audience and all of us to discuss some of this. And so I'd love it if you could start by explaining to folks just who you are and your work on the People's Green New Deal, and sort of what the thesis of it is and anything sort of else about what you're working on that you want to discuss.
Sure. So my name is Max Isle, and I have a long-term interest in the struggles related to the agrarian question, land, national liberation, decolonization, and intellectual history of development in the third world, and especially the Arab region. And so it was with that, sometimes in the back of my mind and sometimes in the front of my mind, that I wrote a book called People's Green New Deal, which was structured as a sharp critique of kind of mainstream, vaguely progressive environmental thought, which basically was arguing that the AOC slash even Bernie campaigns would be appropriate vehicles for a kind of conversion to semi-egalitarian, semi-sustainable US as part and parcel, or as even playing a leadership role in a transition to a sustainable and fuzzily non-capitalist, very fuzzily kind of internationalist world. And I thought that this very widespread notion, which was getting more and more popular, needed to be critiqued because, first of all, as we have seen, these political forces were unwilling to put the issues of the third world on the agenda in a serious way. And we saw this just, for example, recently with AOC saying we need class solidarity and not have purity tests without talking about genocide. And of course, who are poorer amongst the global working class than people in Palestine and Yemen, right? People who are literally making $0 a day, right? And even their assets are being destroyed, right? So they're actually, they're deaccumulating wealth. So anyway, without going too far afield into that, the point is that I thought that this lack of attention to a really rigorous notion of anti-imperialist internationalism was a fatal flaw and needed to be sharply corrected in the first place. In the second place, the place of kind of really thinking about what a transition in the US could and should look like needed a lot of work in terms of thinking about the very important issue of land and landscape management. And the third of all, it was very clear that social democracy, or this kind of vague progressive internationalist plan, was a non-starter in the US context, that the US left just didn't have the power even to put this on the table. Even if you bracketed that it had a very unprincipled outlook about all the other struggles in the world system, in the world, where people wanted and need land justice, climate justice, sustainability, but also needed their daily needs secured and needed all of that secured in countries that are not being aggressed and violently destroyed, whether by sanctions or whether by bombs or whether by neoliberal economics or whether by typhoons, all of which are sown in the north. So I thought that we needed a fundamental critique of these sorts of very mild programs if we wanted a world that was big enough for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think so much of this is about the campaign and the work that we've been doing and sort of learning over the past few weeks has been about really sort of addressing the root issues, that you can't address a crisis that's been rooted in extraction and exploitation and invasion without addressing the war machine and imperialism and the capitalism that drives it. In order to value the planet and the people on it, you need to value life, and capitalism is the opposite of that in so many ways. As we sort of move towards thinking about how to operationalize that and really put internationalist politics and forefront in, especially for me, the largest institutional polluter in the world. What I'm curious your thoughts on sort of what an anti-militarist climate movement looks like, and specifically a little bit of what that means within sort of Western countries, the US, the belly of the beast, and what the relationship of that movement sort of looks like with countries in the global South and the third world.
Yes, so I think that we need to understand a climate movement in the US as fighting for just transition of all the infrastructures and forms of production that exist in the US, from a labor perspective, from an environmental perspective, from a despoliation of indigenous lands in the US perspective, from an anti-racist and feminist perspective, but that needs to be linked crucially, first of all, to the effective dismantling of the military, including all of the military industrial complex, which is not only a major polluter, but a major obstacle to a just transition in terms of the waste of productive infrastructure, that is the waste of factories, of metals, of energy, that occur through not only these forms of wasteful production in the US, but the fact that basically much of the rest of the world's military spending is reactive to the US's military spending, right? Other countries are building up their own military infrastructures, and some of them are really poor and having to make real choices. Should we invest in bridges, or should we have to invest in anti-aircraft batteries to protect ourselves from bombs? Right? They have to make real choices about that that are imposed upon them by the US, right? So in the first case, dismantling of the military industrial complex actually creates a lot more space for other countries to think about their paths. But I think that needs to be braided with a real pro-national liberation and pro-self-determination and anti-imperialist politics. That is, it's fantastic if we can think about what just transitions look like in terms of, say, towns that are embedded, or that, tax bases that are connected somehow to the military industry. But this is not going to get off the ground without a much broader popular groundswell in the United States, which we've seen around Palestine, and we've seen the US state react to it, that is capable of saying people in the third world have the right to determine the direction of their own societies. They have the right to decide who their rulers should be. They have the right to decide their legal systems. They have the right to decide what to produce, how to produce, when to produce it. They have all of these rights. They have the right to not have sanctions imposed upon them. They have the right to choose their alliances. If they want to build solar plants using Chinese technology or Chinese capital, they have the right to do that. And this is not my own normative position. I'm a communist, and believe in the full world-scale decommodification of all production and placing it under popular and state control and so forth, right? Absolutely. But, what that means for people who are living in a very powerful imperial country is that we, I don't live with you guys, need to be pressuring the governments to stop imposing sanctions and stop dropping bombs and stop sending in special forces on these countries that are determining their own path, and let them choose their own path very freely and without being patronizing, and allowing them to choose their own path. And that needs to be a fundamental plank, and not, well, maybe they can kind of have their own self-determination, but we need to remember how nasty they are. Okay, if you keep talking about how nasty they are, you're not going to be able to build a mass movement that supports them choosing how to determine the course of their own lives, as people in the US do, right? So I think this is really needs to be front and center, not just this kind of vague internationalism, but a pro-self-determination and, of course, pro-national liberation politics. And that's really, and taking actions to turn that politics into a real reality for people in the South and people in the North alike.
Absolutely. I think it's so critical that I think we recognize that the movement for international anti-imperialism, national liberation, self-determination is a climate movement, and because that's the only way that we can sort of uproot so many of these systems. So is there any, and build the world that we want. And so is there any thing else that you'd like to share, or you feel that's just really important in this moment, or anything that you'd like to plug?
Nothing to plug, of course. I urge everyone to look at the forefront of some of the campaigns that are occurring, of course, in the UK. Pala Action is doing amazing work, and we should not forget it. And there are, of course, lots of groups trying to link Palestine and broader anti-imperialism with climate action. There are also groups in the South doing that, like Polin Ecology, for example, in Turkey, under very difficult circumstances. So I think we should always be looking to what we can do here and who we can build with over there, walking on both of our feet at the same time. And that's how we move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wow. I feel so much smarter in a very short period of time. Thank you so much, Anthony, for joining us and sharing. And it was lovely having Max and Danica. So, back to what are we doing? It is Earth Day. And as we've heard echoed over and over again, it is the movement that we need to build for all of this, especially, Anthony, you, in such a holistic way, you were able to point to the big picture. I really appreciated that your holistic view of this violent war economy that we live in, and its racism and the insidious violence across the world, and that it's really our engagement as a movement. And so as we finish this Earth Day, we're asking everybody to make a commitment. I mean, this is it's not a hard one. I remember when we first went to COP at Glasgow with this information. I'm marching with 80,000 people. Literally every person I asked, I said, did you know that war is the greatest contributor to climate change? And no was always the answer. But then I would hand them the War Is Not Green pamphlet, and they would anxiously take it because they wanted to learn more. So, I want to say that, this is how we serve the community, is because on purpose, we are uneducated by those in power. They spend a lot of money on educating, hiding. I mean, they literally hid this under the rug at COP in Paris. This isn't allowed to be talked about. So bringing it forward isn't a heavy lift. It's a good lift. It's a loving lift. It's a way to make everyone smarter, like we're just feeling right now. It's like, yes, not only smarter, I just feel like so much more having heard the world I want to live in from everyone. It's just like, this is the world we want to live in. This is what we want to be related to. So just reminding everyone that we do these campaigns. What a campaign does is educate, inspire, and activate. And this campaign is a tool to educate those that have been uneducated or haven't had any relationship to this information. And so how, do we move from Earth Day into more engagement? Erin's going to be able to share with us, but I just want to also do a plug that China is not our enemy. And we did an alert this week that Grace is going to share about the relationships that we should be having with China that would lead to the ultimate climate change, a nuclear winter, if the US gets its way and goes to war on China. But one of the things we can do is actively not be used by the State Department and saying that China is our enemy, but instead that it is not our enemy, and we do need cooperation for the climate. So Erin, take us away on how we can be more engaged as we lift off from Earth Day.
Absolutely. But first, I just want to give Anthony, we're running pretty short on time, but if you have any sort of closing words that you'd like to say.
No, all to say that part of the Black Alliance for Peace Zone of Peace program that is active, and I'll put the website in the chat. That's our call for divesting from the military. I think Jody nailed it. The first thing that we can do, the things that we can control, is a massive narrative shift. And we have to just make sure that people are establishing the nexus. It can't just be on Jody and Code Pink and Black Alliance for Peace to be in Glasgow. And we know that where they're sending these cops these days into militarized areas, right? Azerbaijan, UAE, and most recently, or in Egypt, which are heavily militarized areas. We have to bring this to people's attention. Now, one thing I desperately want to plug, and I will find the link in a moment, is that we just got back, myself, Ajamu Baraka, and our delegation from Black Alliance for Peace. We were down in Ecuador as international election observers, and also to hear from an Afro-Ecuadorian group that we work with down there on a massive oil spill that just took place in the blackest part of the country, Esmeralda province, that has upended the lives of about 350,000 people. A state-owned petroleum pipeline ruptured, and this has just upended people's way of life. When they do try to do anything to find food and water, they are subjected to militarized violence. At the same time, we know this domestic militarized violence in Ecuador is specifically being aimed at Black people. We met with Black mothers whose sons were abducted by the military. Their bodies were found dead and burned about 4 days later, one of them even decapitated. We also met with families whose children are just being shot by cops, and so I'll put more information on what you can do to assist with that effort. We are trying to raise, I would say, a humble amount of funds for our partners down there. But that, to us, we also saw military at the voting booth. Right. So in the blacker districts, militarized people with their AK-47s out while people were attempting to vote and take part in democracy, as our comrade Max said, taking away their self-determination because the people did not get to really choose without being intimidated. So yeah, that's my big takeaway. I'll find that. Thank you, Ajamu Baraka, for putting that link into the thread. Please, everybody, check that out. But it is on us to continue this effort to educate people and to push our friends in the larger mainstream climate community to make this, a big issue. Not just talk about the Pentagon budget, but talk about what the Pentagon budget does and the cost to the climate. Peace is good for the climate. It's as simple as that. Imperialism is bad, and we have to do everything that we can to dismantle empire. And to Jody's point to who our real enemies are. It is not the People's Republic of China. If they really wanted to screw us, they would have stopped buying our debt a long time ago if they were our enemies. And we need global cooperation more than global competition. Global competition leads to more militarism. More militarism leads to more emissions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here. And thank you to Max and Danica and Grace, who's been doing incredible tech this entire time, and Jody as an incredible co-host. It's been, I think, really incredible to learn and to just continue to be grounded every time here and thinking about what the actionable steps that we can take are. And so if you have been at all of these, and thank you so much for those links in the chat, John, but yeah, if you've been at all these webinars and want to continue to take action and try to strategize for the War is Not Green campaign and building an anti-militarist, anti-imperialist, internationalist feminist climate movement, you can go to our next community meeting. It'll be a lot less of me talking and a lot more of everyone talking to strategize. You can take a look at our open letter that we just released that I keep sort of describing as like an arduous baby step into what we're doing in terms of movement building, because just sort of spotlighting the cost of war and the US military to the planet is often just so difficult in so many spaces, and we're trying to assess that and figure out ways to move past that. And so you can sign that letter and get other climate organizations to sign on. There's already about 70 organizations from across different sectors, but we're trying to get more. And so definitely you can send that around, and you can email me your progress and what groups say, and we'll figure it out. Our Earth Day webpage has tons of resources that you can use to sort of locally do that work in, and sharing the letter and connecting so many struggles, both tomorrow if you want to go to Earth Day events, or if you participate in struggles for the US Out of Everywhere, for Palestine, to help in terms of everything that BAP is doing in terms of raising money, inviting climate organizations to, and seeing what they say, doing education. As we've, I think, heard for all this, we're trying to educate to build and to uplift what is often so much what's never uplifted. And so thank you so much. I hope to see you at, and to see everyone at in coalitional partner spaces, and to continue to do this work. And I hope everyone has an incredible Earth Day tomorrow and brings an anti-militarist message there.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Anthony. Onward we go. We're building a movement. This is our resistance every day, to be engaged, to teach, and help those off the toxic waste dump of information that is poured on them into the love and what's necessary for life to thrive, creating conditions conducive for all lives. So much gratitude for all that you do, and that you come and that you learn with us. See you on our call, our wing call. Hope we can move forward together.